Today's delightful topic is conflict between the sexes. So, the reason why we're jumping around in the chapters to some extent is because I think it's important to discuss this topic right after we discuss human mating, since a lot of the conflict, as we'll see, stems from or can be understood by uh, the very facts about how human mating works. So let's start off with a general question. So in general, what causes conflict? Why do people or other species fight with each other? Quite often, it's because individuals are after the same resources, right? They want the same things. And if they want the same things, only one of them can have it, and that can lead to aggression, for example. But when you're talking about conflict between the sexes, that's not usually why it is that men and women fight with each other. It's not because they're after the same thing and only one of them can have it, right? Instead, a lot of the conflict between the sexes seems to arise because of incompatibilities in their mating strategies, right? So we've seen that men and women differ to some extent in what they're after, and satisfying the goals of one sex can often come at the expense of the other. And one of the things that we've seen is that men tend to want sexual access sooner, and they also tend to be more persistent and more aggressive about sex than women in general want them to be. So if men want sex sooner and women want sex to be delayed, then obviously that's an incompatibility in the strategies of mating. Okay, so in general, and obviously there's exceptions, but in general, women want they want to wait to see that there's signs of commitment on the part of the man before committing or consenting to sex. There's many reasons for that, mostly having to do with the fact that women bear the brunt or the significant cost of reproduction. So, it would make sense that they would be choosier and wait for more signs of commitment. But also because delaying sexual access makes them more attractive as as long-term mates, right? So we always have to keep in mind the fact that men seem to make a distinction between women who are good short-term partners and women who are good long-term partners. And often, if they see that a woman's a very willing participant in short-term mating, then she loses her appeal as a possible long-term mate. So this brings up a general theory of conflict called strategic interference theory. Now it applies to conflict between the sexes, but also, it can apply to other types of conflict as well. So strategic interference theory. It says that conflict occurs because someone is stopping an individual from successfully accomplishing a strategy to attain a particular goal. Right, so it's when a person's strategies are blocked or desires are violated by someone else. So whenever if it's in the context of mating, you're trying to achieve a goal and you implement a strategy for attaining that goal, and other people can get in the way of that, right? They can interfere with your strategy. And one very obvious example of that is deception, right? So if you are looking for a mate that is unmarried, as most people are, what would cause strategic interference? If the person that you're interested in said that they weren't married when they in fact are, right? So that's a form of strategic interference, deception. And it really is amazing what people are willing to deceive other people of in the context of mating. You can think of other examples. Wealth, for example. People often, especially men, often claim to be wealthier than they actually are. And I'm sure you can think of lots of other examples of deception. But the point is that this interferes with people's strategies for attaining certain goals, like having a mate with certain characteristics. So how do we combat strategic interference? How do we deal with it? Well, one set of adaptations that we have for dealing with strategic interference is the negative emotions. So when we're talking about negative emotions, we're talking about things like anger, rage, distress, and jealousy, right? Jealousy being something that we'll discuss toward the end of this lecture. So strategic interference, we shouldn't be indifferent to it, right? We shouldn't be indifferent to our goals being thwarted by other people. And what the negative emotions do is they serve as an alarm bell that your strategies are being interfered with and that you're not likely to attain your goals. So how do they help? What are the things that the negative emotions do? Well, first of all, they draw our attention to the problem, right? And one of the things about negative emotions is that they tend to restrict what you're attending to, right? So they focus your attention on that specific problem so that you're not distracted by anything else. If you think about jealousy, for example, if you're feeling jealous because your mate is flirting with someone else, it's really hard to think about anything else, isn't it? Another thing that the negative emotions do is that they enhance and flavor memory, right? So the negative emotions help to color memory. We encode situations with an emotional tone, and when we think about that situation, we tend to think about the associated emotion. So if we went to a bar and our mate was flirting with someone else, we're going to remember that, and we're probably going to avoid that bar in the future. Now, the negative emotions don't just flavor memory and they don't just get you to focus, but they also help to motivate behavior geared towards eliminating the source of the problem, right? So if it's jealousy that we're talking about, one of the things that they do is, one of the things that you might be motivated to do is to separate your mate from the other person. Obviously this can lead to violence in some cases, right? But the point is that they help you to become motivated to do something about it and eliminate the problem. Now, as we said, a lot of the conflicts between the sexes have to do with the occurrence and timing of sex, right? Is sex going to happen? And if so, when? But one of the reasons why this is such a common source of conflict between the sexes is because the sexes differ in the likelihood of inferring sexual interest on the other person. This shouldn't come as a surprise to you, but men are more likely to infer sexual interest on the part of a woman when it isn't there, right? So if you're walking down the hall and a woman is walking in the opposite direction and she smiles at you, if you're a guy, you think, she likes me, right? As opposed to, oh, she's just being friendly. Women are less likely to make that mistake. And one of the classic examples of research that demonstrates this fact that men are much more likely to infer sexual interest than women are is a study by Abbey. Right, so in this one, subjects saw 10-minute film clips. Right, it was a film of a conversation between a female college student and a male professor. So she went to the male professor, an English professor, to ask more time to complete a paper. Now, the actors in the film were told not to be flirtatious, right? And don't behave in an overtly sexual manner. but they were instructed to just be friendly. So the subjects saw this film, and then they had to rate the likely intentions of the woman in the video. And they had to rate them on a scale from 1 to 7. And the intentions were, oh, she's just being friendly, she's trying to be sexy, or she's trying to be seductive. And this is what they found. Right? For friendliness, women and men were similar, right? Women were a little bit, they were more likely to say that she was being friendly than the males were. But look at the differences between men and women in terms of their rating of how likely she is to be trying to be sexy and being seductive. Right? Almost double in some cases. So the upshot is that men have a much lower threshold for inferring sexual interest than women do. So we want to know why. Why is it that men are more likely to infer sexual interest than women are? And this brings up a very interesting theory, which is known as the error management theory. And the theory states that some errors, for any given species, some errors, some mistakes that they can make are costlier than others. And what natural selection should do is it should cause the organism to acquire characteristics that allow it to minimize the costlier errors. And the result of that, when you minimize one kind of error, well, you increase the chances of the other kind of error. Right, so there's two kinds of errors, right? Misses and false alarms. A miss is when you fail to detect a signal, and a false alarm is when you say that a signal was there when it in fact wasn't. So if you want to minimize misses, right, you also increase the false alarms. And if you minimize false alarms, you also increase exponentially the misses. So for men, what is a costly error? Right? What is a costly error? For men, inferring sexual interest when it isn't there, right, is less costly than inferring sexual interest isn't there when it in fact is. Remember that men can increase their inclusive fitness by securing as many mating opportunities as possible. Obviously, that doesn't work for women. So for men, it is beneficial to minimize the misses, but obviously that comes at a cost of ballooning the number of false alarms. Right. Now let's turn to something else, also related to conflict between the sexes and strategic interference. This is the topic of deception about commitment. Right. So we talked about deception when I introduced the strategic interference theory. But one of the things I didn't mention is that a lot of times what people deceive others about is their level of commitment. So another news flash, right? Men are prone to exaggerate their feelings for someone in order to gain sexual access. And obviously this can lead to conflict when the woman finds out that he's not as committed as he claimed to be initially. So one early source of evidence for this was a study by Buss from 1994. It was a very impressive paper, had lots of research in it, lots of experiments, and we'll be discussing some of those today. But what he did was he asked college men and women if they had ever exaggerated the depth of their feelings for a person in order to have sex with them. And incredible result, right? 71% of men admitted to having done so, compared to only 39% for the females. Now, we can understand why men would be much more likely to do so. But why would 39% of women feel the need to do so? right? Why should they lie about their level of commitment in order to get sexual access? After all, there should be, it should be relatively easy to find someone willing to do that, right? So it definitely merits some thought on your part. Maybe it's a topic worth discussing in the postings. Now, we also want to know how to protect ourselves against deception regarding commitment. Right? So how do women especially protect themselves from this kind of deception? One way is by insisting on a courtship phase before consenting to sex. Right? So require a certain number of dates, a certain amount of time to pass before allowing the relationship to proceed in that direction. Why does that work? Because if all a man is interested in is gaining sexual access, they're very quickly going to lose interest, right? They're not going to wait a month or two if that's all they want, right? They're going to lose interest. Another way of protecting ourselves against deceptions regarding commitment is to assess reputations. And for women, assessing a man's reputation is very valuable, right? So has he lied about commitment to others, right? Does he have a pattern of this sort of behavior? And when you think about gossip, this is the kind of thing that people talk about. And it's not always accurate, but people do seem to use it, and it may be useful to some extent. Turning now to sexual harassment, right, another source of strategic interference. Sexual harassment is unwanted and unsolicited sexual attention from other individuals. Now, obviously, it varies in severity, right? There's mild forms like unwanted staring or leering to obviously outright physical violations. No surprise here, men tend to be the harassers, and the victims tend to be usually young single women under age 45. Why should that be the case? Because obviously from a sexual perspective, younger women are more desirable than older women, and if the woman is unattached, then there's less chance of reprisal from an angry mate. Now, it's also interesting that sexual harassment can work in both directions, but men and women differ dramatically in how they feel about the prospects of being harassed. So in this 94 paper, one of the questions that Buss asked men and women is, how would you feel if a coworker just flat out asked you to have sex, right, out of the blue? 63% of the women said they'd be insulted, while 17% said that they'd be flattered. For the men, it was complete opposite, right? 67% said they'd be flattered, while only 15% said that they would be insulted. So why is there this reversal? Right? We need to keep in mind the strategic interference theory. Right? The very same act can be consistent with the mating strategy of one sex and inconsistent with the mating strategy of the other sex. Right? And for men, since they tend to be more prone to short-term mating, and they can invest less in reproduction, this proposal is more consistent with their mating strategy than with the mating strategies of women. Now, there is also evidence that although women in general tend to react negatively to sexual harassment, their reaction also tends to depend on the social status of the harasser. All right, so this seems to be a big factor. So Buss asked 109 women to rate how upset they would be if a man they didn't know closely persisted in asking them out on a date despite their repeated refusals. And what he did in the study is he varied the profession of the harasser. Right? So some professions were high status, like doctors, lawyers. Others would be lower status, like say a dock worker or a factory worker. And what he found is that women reported that be more upset if a man was of lower social status than if he was of higher social status. And why is that? Again, think about strategic interference. Right? One of the things that, and what's consistent with the mating strategies of women. One of the things that women find desirable in a mate is higher social status. So it's even, although harassment is undesirable to women, it's much more inconsistent with their mating strategies if the man is also of low status, since that's not something that they want. Now, sexual harassment often leads to sexual aggression, which is the next topic here. So sexual aggression is when sexual intimacy is forced by failing to get mutual consent prior to initiating sex. Now, sexual aggressiveness is one of the least desirable characteristics in a mate for women. Right, so it's near the bottom of the traits. So why does it happen? Obviously, this is a complex topic. There's many reasons for sexual aggression, but one potentially really important factor is that men don't understand how upsetting sexual aggression is to women. Right, so when men rate how negative sexual aggressiveness is on women, they don't rate it as negative as women rate it for themselves. So men may be prone to use sexual aggression because they don't feel that, or they don't understand how upsetting it is to women. They figure, well, I wouldn't mind if a woman was sexually aggressive with me, so therefore she probably wouldn't mind if I was sexually aggressive with her. Now, not all men are prone to use sexual aggressiveness as a mating strategy, but there are a couple factors that seem to predict likelihood of being sexually aggressive. And it's really not one of, either of these independently, it's a combination of the two that seems to be important. One is men who pursue the impersonal sex path. These are men who use sex as a way of gaining status among their peers, right? Bragging rights about who they've had sex with. It bolsters their self-esteem and their standing among their friends. Right? So they try to, rack up as many conquests as possible so they can brag. And the second factor that seems to be important is the hostile masculinity path. So these are men who are insecure, defensive, hostile, distrustful, especially towards women, right? And they derive a lot of pleasure from dominating them. So these are men who somehow feel that women in their life have wronged them, and so they feel that women have done something to them, and the consequence of that is that they don't feel a lot of empathy towards them, which makes them more likely that they'll be aggressive. Now, I want to end by talking about jealousy, also known as the green-eyed monster. Although jealousy is not something that we enjoy feeling, jealousy is an adaptation, right? It serves a function, it serves a purpose. So what are the things that it does? Well, you don't always feel jealous, right? So one of the things that it does is that it draws attention, a person's attention to circumstances in which their partner might be unfaithful, right? So if your partner tells you that she's going out with her friends to a bar, the jealousy module might kick in. So that's a possibility where there's a potential location where infidelity might arise. Or if she's got to work late with her boss or something like that, your jealousy mechanisms might kick in. The second thing that it does is it prompts actions that are designed to limit a person's partner's contact with others. Right? So if you're at a bar with your girlfriend, you might put your arm around her, you might stand between her and other guys, limiting her contact with the other guys. More positively, right, jealousy can motivate you to do a better job in the relationship, right? Fulfilling your partner's desires. If you do that to the best of your ability, it makes it less likely that your partner will want to stray. And another thing that jealousy does is it can cause people to threaten or fend off rivals who show an interest in your partner. All right, so a lot of men get into fights with each other because of this. So it's jealousy doing its job, albeit in a very negative way. So the other thing that we know is that when you hear about jealousy, it tends to be more of an issue for males. Although we all know that there's plenty of women who are also suffering from issues of jealousy, right? But why in general is it a bigger issue for men? Why are they more likely to suffer from problems with jealousy? Well, it has to do with the fact that jealousy protects men from cuckoldry, right? It prevents men from, or helps to prevent men from unknowingly raising someone else's children. Right? That's a huge fitness cost for men. Men, when they engage in parenting, they tend to invest a lot of resources, and they want those resources to be, going to their own genetic offspring as opposed to somebody else's. Right? So sexual infidelity is hugely negative for men. Right? It's the least desirable characteristic in a wife. Right? Now, for women, obviously, infidelity is also highly undesirable. But other factors are more negative for them, including sexual aggressiveness. Now, evolutionary psychologists like to distinguish between two different kinds of infidelity, right? They distinguish between sexual infidelity and emotional infidelity. Sexual infidelity is having sexual relations with someone other than your long-term partner, while emotional infidelity refers to forming a deep bond and attachment with someone other than your long-term partner. So, are the two sexes equally upset by these two types of infidelity? And research has tried to tease these apart, although in reality they're closely related. Why? Because if you think about your partner forming a deep emotional attachment to someone else, you might think that, well, sex could be the logical next step, right? And the other way around as well. But research shows that women in general become more jealous, right, at the prospects of emotional infidelity, while men seem to get more bent out of shape about the possibility of sexual infidelity. So one of the classic studies on this was done by Buss, Larson, Weston, and Semmelroth. They asked, now I would want to be a participant in this study, but they asked people the following. Imagine that you discover that the person with whom you've been seriously involved became interested in someone else. What would distress you more? A, imagining your partner forming a deep emotional attachment to that person, or B, imagining your partner enjoying passionate sexual intercourse with that person. And 60% of men picked sexual infidelity as more distressing, while women, 85% of women, picked emotional infidelity as more distressing. Right? And in another study, they actually recorded physiological responses of men, right, and women while imagining sexual and emotional infidelity. So they recorded heart rate and also the galvanic skin response, right? So they put, a sensor on the hand, and that measures sweat on the hand, which can happen as a result of stress. So you start to conduct more electricity. And they found that men showed more physiological distress as a result of imagining sexual infidelity, while women showed more physiological distress as a result of imagining emotional infidelity. Now, why should there be these sex differences in jealousy? Well, we have to keep in mind what's more costly from their inclusive fitness, right? What's more costly to a man's inclusive fitness? Sexual infidelity. Why? Because of parental uncertainty, right? Sexual infidelity is more likely to cause them to unknowingly raise someone else's child. Emotional infidelity is less likely to do that, right? And why should emotional infidelity be more of an issue for women? Because if a man forms an emotional attachment to another woman, it increases the chances that he's going to channel his resources towards her instead of the original woman, right? Sexual infidelity, just having sexual relations with someone else, is less likely to lead to a loss of commitment of resources on the part of a man. But as I said, in reality, sexual infidelity and emotional infidelity are closely related, but they can be separated experimentally, and the results make sense from an evolutionary perspective.